Welcome back, Honors. All right, so welcome back to your flips and stuff and whatever and whatnot. And I know this is like probably you're doing this on like a Saturday or Sunday unless you're Gianna and you're trying to get this done in S period on Friday, which is completely fine too. Whatever, you do what you got to do. Now, anyway, so we left off in class talking about ancient Egypt, right? We were discussing the ancient Egyptian time periods. We were talking about going from Old Kingdom, New Kingdom, Intermediate, Second Intermediate, etc., etc., etc. We talked about the 7 big ones, talked about Hnrs, talked about Djoser, right? So what you'll notice is there's going to be a handful of important figures that get thrown up here when it comes to the ancient Egyptian historic periods, right? We're going to talk about Djoser, Sensoret, Hnrs, and a guy named Khufu, right? So very, very intense name, Khufu. Now, but we'll discuss those over this entire time. Make sure you're kind of focusing on like highlighting those names and stuff because a big part of my first test or a big part of my test is always like the historic figures that are very, very like first. They come up at the very, very top of every single test. But we'll get into that. But like, let's pick right up where we left off. We were talking about the Old Kingdom, right? And since we were in an Old Kingdom, that means that we were having a period of progress and prosperity. This followed immediately the Archaic period, of course, when the Egypts were unified, right? And then during the Old Kingdom period, Djoser sets up into a system of nomes, right? N-O-M-E-S, right? Very important word. And the nome system basically divides up into a series of states and creates Egypt into a very fluid empiric standard and a fluid kingdom centralized around one place. And as we know, that is very, very vastly different from the methods of the Mesopotamians, which is a series of city-states, right? So during the Old Kingdom, you also saw the earliest phases of large-scale Egyptian architecture. We talked about this in class. You saw some of the earliest pyramids show up, right? So this, for example, is one known as the bent pyramid, right? So, no, that's the medium pyramid, and that's the bent pyramid. Now, so the medium pyramid resembles the looks a lot of a Mesopotamian ziggurat, indicating that there may have been a chance that these two communities started to communicate with each other. Possibly that's a little bit of cultural diffusion there. We'll bring that word back up again later. And then also this right here is the bent pyramid, and that right there is the pyramid of Djoser. So the interesting, that's actually where Djoser was supposed to be buried. Now, really, really quick though, and his mummy and all that stuff, right? After he had his guts pulled out. So now the really cool thing though is over time, pyramid architecture and large-scale architecture in ancient Egypt is going to get much, much more sophisticated. And most of these these buildings are all constructed out of solid brick limestone, and so it takes a long period of time to make them. So most of those pyramids were actually completed decades and decades and decades and decades after the person that was actually meant to go inside of it was already dead. Now, anyway, but the big thing though is going into the Old Kingdom period even further. You also saw the construction of the Great Pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx, right? So the Great Pyramids of Giza are the 3 massive pyramids that are flanked in front by 3 smaller pyramids that everybody knows very, very well. Here's a picture actually of the main largest pyramid in Giza right there. And as you can see, over time, it is not actually looking the way that it's supposed to look anymore. This pyramid right here is supposed to be smooth on the outside. Do you see the top little corner area right here? That little tip? That's what it's supposed to closer resemble when it comes to when it was fully constructed and what was brand new. So the big thing about the pyramids of Giza is that you should be able to you should be able to ride a skateboard down the side of it because the sides are supposed to be smooth. But as you can see, the smooth part's all been harvested away and it's all gone. Now, is that natural or is that going to be a man-made issue? It actually is man-made because when the Egyptians fell much later on and they started building the modern-day city of Cairo, they actually harvested a ton of limestone off of their ancient site and used it to build the city of Cairo, which is really, really sad. Now, anyway, but going into it a little bit more, you saw the construction of the Sphinx in Giza under this guy named Khufu, this pharaoh, right? K-H-U-F-U, okay? So now a lot of people falsely attribute the growth and the building of the pyramids of Giza to that of like the Hebrews and the Jewish communities in Egypt during this time period. Now, that's probably impossible due to the fact that the Hebrews, we believe, founded their city of Canaan around 1500 BC. So this is about 1,000 years too early. And then also there's just no archaeological evidence of that whatsoever. Also, we believe evidence shows that actually Egyptians worked on this not of slave labor, but because they were forced to. Now, getting into that, the whole thing, Khufu was apparently not a very liked guy, all right? So, and this is very important when we actually discuss the first intermediate period coming up here in a second. So, statue. There is only one remaining statue of the Pharaoh Khufu, right? And it's literally only this big. So, like, it's only about yay big, very, very tiny, very, very small. And a lot of historians believe that's because his people absolutely hated his guts, right? So he threw human death and suffering at these pyramids, and a lot of people died in the construction of these pyramids because the one central one that I just showed you, the middle pyramid of Giza, is 454 feet tall. So it's massive. It's an absolutely humongous structure. So it would have taken a ton of labor and cost a lot of lives to actually completely build and finish that entire temple that was meant to house his dead body and later parts of his dynasty. Now, because of this, since people died and suffered in the building of these things, they destroyed every single statue of Khufu except for this last little one that actually managed to come out and managed to survive. So basically, in the long run, just because you're like a god king doesn't necessarily mean your people like you. All right. So now the other big thing, though, is even though in response to all this, even though that there were some bad leaders and stuff like that, there were massive gains in architecture in the Egyptian development, and also art began to actually show a massive progress, and it began to adopt the cultural significant qualities that made ancient Egyptian art, right? For example, the different sculptures that were actually produced during this time period. Free-form sculptures that included the entire prototypical physical body that was completely proportional, and also it indicated motion, right? So as you see right here, his foot is coming forward. It's trying to indicate motion to make it more lifelike and less static, right? And you can see another example of that right here, which actually includes one of the pharaohs wearing one of the Old Kingdom crowns, and also he is flanked on either side by two female goddesses, possibly one of his wives. Now, then, after art developed, after the pyramids started getting constructed, after all this other stuff started happening, then from 2181 BC to about 2055, which is a relatively short period of time when we actually discuss like these ancient time periods and stuff like that, the first intermediate period hit, right? So the first intermediate period, and as we know from when we talked about this in class, intermediate means it's a time of despair, destruction, and sadness, and stuff like that, right? Well, it's because the first intermediate period was home to civil war. What is the thing that marked the archaic period under Menes? That is exactly right, Lily Bourgeois. Very, very good. Good job with your baby hands. All right.
Want some peanut butter? Yummy! Get it off the baby hands.
What's up?
Oh, I did nothing. Just need to wash these. Got something in your tooth right there. That's just...
Hey, take your baby hands out of my mouth.
They're not even dirty.
What?
Nothing.
What's up? Is there something I need to be worried about?
I highly recommend using some mouthwash.
Tastes like peanut butter.
That's exactly right. Sorry, that's that video I was telling y'all about that it reminds me of every time I see the baby hands thing. But look, the Civil War is going to break out because, according to Lily, which she's 100% right, the two kingdoms united in the archaic period under Menes, while in this period they split yet again, had their own leaders and pharaohs, and then they had a massive civil war with each other. Just to give you a heads up, if you don't know the difference between a civil war and a regular war, a civil war is a war that occurs inside a country between two different populations, right? For example, the United States had a civil war, right, between the North and the South. We need to know this term, civil war, because it does come up in this class all the time. So political power is going to be divided between those two kingdoms, and the civil war is going to result in temples being destroyed, tombs being pillaged and robbed, like different artifacts not making it out alive because they were stolen and hawked and sold. But eventually what would happen, after a massive campaign of organizing the army and creating a more sophisticated army, Lower Egypt is going to conquer Upper Egypt and reunify all that land, which is actually surprising considering the fact that the capital of ancient Egypt, Memphis, is in Upper Egypt. You would imagine that they would have been more populated and then also more prepared for this war, but apparently not. So how does this conflict, though, with this concept of theocracy? This is a really good question. Wait a minute. We had a really bad emperor a second ago. Khufu was a terrible emperor, right? So I don't care if you've got like Oh, by the way, this is actually some architectural evidence showing the Civil War, and actually is like a documentation. This right here is what ancient Egyptian military looked like. They used simple like swords and pikes and spears and things like that. Also had wooden shields. They also had divisions of archers. And right here, actually, the Egyptians using one of their big military things that they actually didn't invent necessarily, but they adopted from some of the other Fertile Crescent societies, is a chariot, right? A lot of times when people think chariot, they actually think Roman. And some of you are also seeing right here a cheetah right there. It's like, oh my God, Mr. Jerry, did they have armored cheetahs in their army? Well, no, actually. Apparently it was a pharaoh that kept about 30 of them in cages and stuff like that, tamed cheetahs that he would actually ride into battle and stuff like that with. But as you can see, Egyptian military, very sophisticated stuff. But then on this whole other subject we were just talking about, how does the concept of a civil war conflict with this? You can ignore this stupid little line. How does it conflict with the idea of their theocracy? I thought for a hot second when we talked about all this other stuff that they believed their king was like a god, right? They thought their pharaohs were an extension of Amun-Ra, right? That he was, in essence, the microphone for the ideas of God through the priests and things like that. Well, the people began to adopt this idea known as Mot, right? So now Mot became a very, very important construction of Egyptian culture and things like that, and like many, many, many other things during the Middle Kingdom we're about to discuss. But following the first intermediate period, you saw the rise of this concept of Mot. Because for the very first time, the Egyptians had their very traumatic incident in their history where they had this massive civil war where they didn't want to trust this particular pharaoh. They had just got done building those pyramids and stuff and having thousands of people die. So in the Middle Kingdom period that will follow, you're going to see this concept of Mot rise up. Mot is the concept of harmony and balance. And it actually is two different things. It's both a force and it's both a goddess, right? So the goddess Mot actually sits right here, and on her head, I don't know if you can actually see it, she actually wears the feather of truth that your heart is weighed against in your judgment story, right? So we'll talk about that stuff again a little bit later on. But apparently in ancient Egyptian judgment, your heart was weighed against the feather of truth, right? And if they were balanced out, it means that you were prepared to go on to their heaven. She actually wears that on her head, and she also is a winged goddess to try and show balance, right? So the idea of Mot is that this justice concept, balance and truth, keeps this, oh God, don't throw up, keeps the society from crumbling in on itself, right? So people believed that being ethical and maintaining Mot kept you very, very happy. Kind of like karma in an essence, right? They also then begin to project that onto the pharaohs, right? That if the pharaohs violated Mot, that means that the gods would be unkind to him, would believe that he is not truly a god anymore, and it gave people the right to rise up and actually overthrow or go into a rebellion. So this concept of Mot is very, very important, and it kind of brought balance to this entire traumatic first intermediate period following it and going into the Middle Kingdom. Now, going further with that, speaking of Middle Kingdom, we did have a very large rebirth of intelligence of government during this time period, because you have to understand, the Middle Kingdom followed that first intermediate period. They adopt this concept of Mot to try and bring balance and understanding back to their ancient society. And so with that, they're going to see another massive explosion of growth and intelligence. And that's going to happen from the 11th to the 12th dynasties. Now, the guy that's going to come in and kind of stabilize everything and be the best pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom is this dude named Sensoret, right? Sensoret had the most impact as a pharaoh during the Middle Kingdom because he created a couple of different things. He brings in the concept of Mot. He works to establish Osiris as the chief god to explain the Nile and authority of the pharaoh. Now, when we say chief god, we don't mean above Amun-Ra. We mean that he is like the chief god as in the power of the pharaohs, the regularity of the Nile, the enforcer of Mot, and then also the guy that apparently is like, he's like the main daily god. He is like the god that people kind of relate to most on a regular basis, whereas Amun-Ra is still the one true, like, supreme god. But also, big thing about Sensoret is he managed to make the government way more efficient. Now, this is genius, okay? What Sensoret does is he creates an efficient bureaucratic system, right? So this is what I mean by the Egyptian bureaucratic system created by Sensoret. Now, here it is. So basically, Sensoret realized going into the first intermediate period that it was becoming harder and harder for like the pharaohs to rule over a growing kingdom, right? Because you have to understand, during the Old Kingdom period, they also like took over some other people. Like there was the kingdom of the Nubians that they would oftentimes have wars with, and they actually ended up taking over a small parcel of their land. They actually were growing in size, and they were looking to expand. Well, the problem is if you keep getting larger and larger and larger, you run into the problem of how is a pharaoh supposed to rule over this giant amount of territory, including thousands of different people, and do all this different work all at the same time? Well, the way that they're going to figure this out is due to the fact that the pharaoh, but then under Sensoret, created a bureaucracy. And what a bureaucracy is an efficient multi-leveled government to make it so any decree that a pharaoh has will be carried out efficiently by all these other people. So here's what I mean by that. Looks suspiciously like a pyramid, I know. But here is Sensoret, or the pharaoh, up here at the top. He is then underneath him ranked by two types of people. Viziers, which are actually his advisors. Jafar in Aladdin is a royal vizier. And then also priests, or high priests. They discuss with him the will of the gods. He discusses with the viziers how he wants to do a decree of, we're going to increase tax collection by X number of grains, right? Because remember, the Egyptians didn't pay taxes in money, they paid taxes in farm products, right? Because money hadn't been invented yet. The money doesn't get invented until like getting close to the Greek period, actually. Now, going into it even further, though, the viziers then tell these people known as royal overseers. Royal overseers then go to the district governors, and those district governors are all in charge of the different nome system. The district governors tell the scribes encode it and write it down, and then it carries itself into the artisans and laborers of society. So this way, with Sensoret, you've got this multi-level government, so the pharaoh can just say to do a thing, and then it will happen, and it'll be much more efficient. It's kind of like the way Miss Dantagnan runs the school, right? So she would be like our leader, and she is considered like our pharaoh, right? Our pharaoh queen. And she then tells Miss Panzavecchia, Miss Rowley, and Miss Spafford what we're going to do. And then they tell the teachers, and then we tell your parents, and then we tell everybody else in society that actually is important until we get all the way down to the bottom to y'all, way down there, real far down there. Now, anyway, so that was really, really important when it comes to the construction of the Middle Kingdom and the concept of the pharaoh working more efficiently to avoid another intermediate period later on. Now, going into it, though, life in ancient Egypt is also going to become much more stabilized and much more efficient when it comes to the concepts of the Middle Kingdom, right? Because Mot and the Pharaoh is going to be coming in, and this is going to give people the justifiable chance to rebel. Now, this is an interesting concept because with Mot being brought in during the Middle Kingdom and kind of solidified, this is going to give the pharaohs like a moral code they have to follow. If I am a jerk and if I am mean, Mot will be thrown off balance and the people will rebel against me, and I will have another intermediate period on my hands that I cannot effectively control, right? If the pharaoh lies or unjust, they're going to rebel and overthrow and usher in a new dynasty. This actually relates very heavily to the first and second intermediate periods, right? That's that big connection. And then also, the Egyptians are going to formally break up their calendar and create their 3 big seasons, okay? So I don't know if you know this from that. But according to Egyptians, they had 3 seasons, not 4. Now, this makes a lot of sense when you're thinking about being in a desert environment, right? So now they had flood season, which was June to September. They had draining season, which is October to February. And then they had harvest season, which is March to April. So between draining season, or in draining season, that is when they would plant. And actually, as the drainage went backwards, it would then supply water and different goods for the crops. And in about November is usually when they would plant, and harvest season came around March, right? So as you can see, it's a very, very important way of doing things. And also, they even had a very sophisticated kind of calendar to be able to understand it and to understand the different seasons and the regularity of the floods of the Nile. So as you can see, the Middle Kingdom really solidified a lot of cultural aspects of ancient Egypt. For example, you saw ancient Egyptian homes being created in a certain style, right? You saw ancient Egyptian people functioning in a very different kind of way. You saw tax collection becoming much more efficient because ancient Egyptians paid their taxes in the forms of their harvest, right? Farmers were required to give the government a certain amount of grain to avoid getting a beating. Now, because apparently if you didn't farm enough stuff, they'd beat you. which is really messed up. So, but farmers were required to give the government certain amounts of grains to avoid a famine later on, and also because some grains were actually stored in temples to be sacrificial allotments to gods and things like that. But also, we're now going to be jumping into this next part of ancient Egypt, right? We got a little bit more to do, and then we're done, okay? So the big thing going into ancient Egypt, though, is that following their Middle Kingdom and following the formalization of a lot of these different cultural ideals and stuff like that, the second intermediate period is going to show up. Now, this one, interestingly enough, though, was not a violation of Mot and not a rebellion against the Pharaoh. This is an invasion of people from the outside, right? So these folks invaded. They're called the Hyksos, right? So the Hyksos were these people that we only know about as according to the ancient Egyptians. But the Egyptians portrayed these invaders of the Hyksos as a conquering horde that were actually probably not a conquering horde of people. They were probably just people looking for a good land near the delta. Because where the Hyksos started to show up and invade ancient Egypt was right here around the delta, right? And in the second intermediate period, they actually took over the ancient Egyptian capital of Memphis, right? And now the really big thing, though, that is going to happen is cultural diffusion, right? So this Hyksos group shows up, and they're a very, 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 like, regular group of people. Like I said, the Egyptians portrayed them as this, like, conquering horde of disgusting people and barbarians and stuff like that. But they actually were just a normal, kind of probably nomadic tribe of people. Because according to a lot of the evidence that we have left behind, they look or appear as though they were herders, right? So, but the Egyptians portray them as this conquering horde of, like, people that they had to be destroyed and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The thing about it was, some of you are probably thinking to yourselves, like, how is it possible that a group of people like this, these Hyksos people that were just herders of goats and things like that, it looks like, how did they take over ancient Egypt after they had already gone through a civil war and actually made a constructed military regime? I'll explain that, Damari. Now, the big thing about it, though, is because the Hyksos had certain weapons that the Egyptians had never seen. For example, Egyptians had very simple drawstring bow and arrows, right, that were not very efficient and couldn't go very far, right? The Hyksos had these things known as composite bows that were actually made of both animal fibers, animal sinews on the drawstrings, and then also reed, like bow shafts, so they could actually hit it and throw it a lot longer and actually much more accurately. They also, Hyksos, were much more adept in the metallurgy of bronze making and actually making better and harder alloys, so their weapons were much sharper. So when the Hyksos showed up and the Egyptians attacked them, the Hyksos were just like, no, please stop, and then like basically efficiently beat them in several different battles. But then as time went on, the big thing that's going to happen is cultural diffusion is going to take place. Since the Hyksos took over Upper Egypt, what's going to happen is these wars and trade is going to cause those weapons to eke their way into ancient Egypt, because you got to understand something very important. Cultural diffusion is probably the biggest like motivator or thing about this class. Every time a group of people trade or go to war, they kind of exchange cultural ideas, right? It's kind of like the ideas of, for example, the Greeks did not know what money was, but then eventually they traded with the Persians, and the Persians paid them with coins, and they were like, oh my God, we can do this? And so they adopted coinage systems. So when the Hyksos came in and actually took over the Delta using these new weapons and all these new methods and stuff like that, the Egyptians learned how to make them and would later on actually rise up, fight the Hyksos in a war, and drive them out. Now, there's also a lot of other stuff about the Hyksos we'll talk about later, but we're going to talk about that stuff in class. So I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.